Okay, in lesson 13, our objective was multiply unit fractions by unit fractions. And the standard for 5th grade also says that they have to represent. So we're going to be really trying to understand the drawing. And then we'll look at the standard algorithm for it. Okay, so on problem 1, it says half of half a cake equals. So where it says half, we know it's half of 1/2. And we know anytime we say half of, it means 1/2 times 1/2. So what we would do is we would draw ourselves a rectangle. And I'm going to draw 1/2. And then I'm going to shade in, or what I like to call crosshatch, half of it. Now in the second one it says 1/2, so I'm going to now do this one horizontally. I'm going to cut it in half. And now I'm cross-hatching this one. Now the product of two fractions is always going to be represented by the intersection, which in this case happens to be right here. It's the only one that is occupied by both fractions, because here we have 1/2, here we have 1/2, and they have this one block in common. So we can see the denominator would be 4, and there's 1 out of 4. Now what we did in class once we were doing this, we took a look at was 1/2 times 1/2, and we'd equal 1/4. So we understood that if we drew it, how to do it, and we also understood the standard algorithm now would work. On B, it's 1/3 of 1/2. So we know that's going to be 1/3 times 1/2. So once again, if we split it in half, shade in 1/2. Horizontally, we're going to go to thirds, and we're shading in 1/3. We can see our denominator is going to be a total of 6, and there's 1 that was in common, both of them. When we do our standard algorithm, we can see 1 times 1 is 1, and 3 times 2 is 6. So it checks. The second one shows that they multiplied them across to get 1 and 8, but the model you would have to draw for it would be 1/4. I would split it in half, then I would split those halves into halves, giving us quarters. Shade in 1/4. On horizontally, we were going to do half, and then we're going to shade them in, and we can see that 1/2 times 1/4 would equal, and we have a total of 8, so that's a denominator, and there's 1 that is combined in both fractions, 1/8. So both of them worked. On D, we're drawing our model, and 1/2, and we're shading in that half. And horizontally, we have 1/5. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're shading in 1/5. And we can see here is this is 1/2, this is 1/5, and our answer is 1/10. Okay, 1/3 times 1/3. Drawing a drawing, doing it thirds. And this way, thirds. And we can see that would equal, we have a total of 9 and 1 that's in common, so it'll be 1/9. And we can see 1 times 1 is 1, 3 times 3 is 9. F, we've got 1/4, so I'm going to split it in half, then splitting the halves in halves for quarters. And we're shading in 1/4. Now we're going to do 1/3, so I'm splitting it horizontally into thirds. And we're shading in, and we can see here now we'd have a denominator of 12 over 1. So when we multiply, it would be 1/12. On 2 says Noah mows 1/2 of his property and leaves the rest wild. He decides to use 1/5 of the wild area for a vegetable garden. What fraction of the property is used for the garden? Okay, so we can see if we drew it here, and it says half of his property, which is this right here, is for the wild. Then it says he wants to use 1/5 of the wild area for vegetables. So we're going to split this up into fifths. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And that's 1/5. So 1/5. So we shaded in our half. Now we're shading in our fifth. And we can see 1/2 times 1/5. We can see here we have 2 by 5, so our denominator is going to be 10. And there's only 1 where they both intersect, so it's going to be 1/10. And we can double check that because 1 times 1 is 1, 2 times 5 is 10. It checks. On 2 says Fawn plants 2/3 of the garden with vegetables. Her son plants the remainder of the garden. He decides to use 1/2 of this space for plant flowers, and in the rest he plants herbs. What fraction of the entire garden is planted in flowers? Now this one's kind of tricky, because if we do our drawing here, and it first says 2/3. So I'm going to go ahead and do this into thirds, but it says her son it says the fawn plants 2/3 for vegetables. Then it says her son plants the remainder in the garden. So this here is the garden. He decides to use 1/2 of the space. So in all actuality, we're shading into 1/3 because we're talking about the 1/3, not the 2/3 here. It says he decides to use 1/2 of the space for flowers. So here's half the space, and we're going to shade them in. Now, as we can see, it says what fraction of the entire garden, okay, so is used to plant flowers. So we can see that here we ended up with 1/3 times 1/2, which equals 1/6. And we can see this here is the part right here, which was flowers. Which was 1/6. 4. Diego eats 1/5 of the loaf of bread each day. On Tuesday, he eats 1/4 of the day's portion before lunch. What fraction of the whole loaf does he eat before lunch on Tuesday? Okay, so it says Diego eats 1/5 of a loaf of bread each day. On Tuesday, he eats 1/4 of the day's portion before lunch. What fraction of the whole loaf does Diego eat before lunch on Tuesday? Okay, so we're going to come up with our diagram. And it says he eats 1/5. So we're going to split this up into fifths. And we're shading in 1/5. And then it says on Tuesday he eats 1/4 day before lunch. So here's our quarters. We're going to split them into quarters. I split it into half, then the halves into quarters. And we're going to shade in 1/4. Because it says before lunch, and the question said what fraction of the whole loaf does he eat before lunch? Okay, so now we can see this is 1/5 times 1/4, and this is the only part that is common, and it's a 4 by 5, so we know we're going to have a denominator of 20, and there's only 1, so he eats 1/20 before lunch.